There are moments when standing before ancient stone, you feel something that does not belong to the present. Not a clear thought, not an idea you can explain, but a quiet pressure beneath awareness, as if the ground itself is holding its breath. The stone is still. It does not speak. And yet, it feels older than the stories we tell about it, older than the timelines we memorize, older even than the memory we believe humanity carries about itself. Perhaps that sensation is familiar to you, a subtle realization that the past may not be as simple as we assume. We often imagine history as a straight road, a beginning, a slow rise, mistakes corrected over time, knowledge accumulating like layers of sediment, from stone tools to cities, from fire to electricity, from silence to speech. It is comforting to believe that we are standing at the far end of that road, the most recent and therefore the most complete version of humanity. But what if that road is an illusion? What if history is not a line at all, but a circle so large that we mistake one arc for the whole journey? When you look closely at the world around you, it becomes difficult to ignore how small human memory truly is. Written history stretches back only a few thousand years. Before that, we rely on fragments. Before that, on inference. And before that, there is almost nothing. Yet the planet itself is unimaginably old. Oceans have risen and fallen. Ice sheets have swallowed continents. Forests have grown where deserts now stretch. Entire ecosystems have appeared and vanished without leaving names behind. In such a world, is it truly unreasonable to ask whether human-like intelligence could have risen, fallen, and been erased long before our earliest records began? This does not require imagining advanced machines or cities of glass. It requires only time, instability, and forgetting. Perhaps there were worlds before ours that never reached the point of writing, or perhaps they did, and those writings burned, rotted, or sank beneath the sea. Time is not kind to memory. It erases quietly and thoroughly. And when it erases, it leaves behind a silence that feels natural, as if nothing was ever there at all. We often confuse absence of evidence with evidence of absence. But absence can be manufactured by the planet itself. Consider how fragile knowledge truly is. Wood decays, cloth dissolves, metal corrodes, even stone cracks, crumbles, and returns to sand. If a civilization existed tens of thousands of years ago, what chance would it have of leaving behind something we could still recognize today? Perhaps only the hardest materials, the most accidental remnants, would survive. And even then, stripped of context, they would look like curiosities rather than proof. There is another assumption we rarely question, that humanity emerged once, progressed steadily, and never truly fell back to zero. But nature does not behave that way. Species rise and vanish. Entire branches of evolution end abruptly. Earth resets itself again and again through fire, ice, flood, and impact. If intelligence is part of nature, why would it be exempt from this pattern? What if consciousness itself has appeared more than once, only to be erased before it could anchor itself in lasting memory? Imagine a world far older than ours, one without borders or names, where people lived close to the rhythms of the planet. They would not think of themselves as primitive. They would simply be human, adapted to their time, their climate, their sky. They might build in ways that made sense to them, using stone, sound, alignment, and landscape. They might understand things we no longer do, not because they were superior, but because their world demanded different skills. And then, slowly or suddenly, that world would end, not with drama recorded in chronicles, but with silence. A climate shift, a flood, a chain of disasters close enough together that recovery becomes impossible. Survivors scatter, knowledge fractures. Within a few generations, what was once lived experience becomes story, then myth, then nothing. And eventually, even the myth fades, leaving only a faint discomfort when we stand before certain stones or look at certain patterns in the earth. Perhaps this is why some places feel heavier than others. Not haunted, but saturated, as if too much time has passed there. As if layers of existence have pressed down on the same ground again and again. Standing in such places, it is easy to feel that we are late arrivals, stepping onto a stage where many acts have already played out. This idea is unsettling because it removes our sense of uniqueness. It suggests that we are not the first to wonder, not the first to build, not the first to look at the sky and ask what it means. But it is also strangely humbling. It places us within a much larger story, one that does not revolve around progress or decline, but around repetition. Rise, collapse, forgetting, and rise again. Like breathing, like tides. If that is true, then what we call prehistory may not be a blank page, but a palimpsest written over so many times that only hints of earlier words remain. The planet remembers even if we do not. It stores memory in stone, in ice, in layers of sediment compressed under unimaginable pressure, and every so often something surfaces that feels out of place. A reminder that the story we tell ourselves may be incomplete. This is not a claim, it is a question, a gentle one. What if humanity did not begin once, but many times? What if our world is not the first world, but simply the one that has lasted long enough to speak about itself? And what if the silence before our history is not empty at all, but full of lives that passed, learned, and vanished without leaving their names behind? As we move forward, we will not search for certainty. Certainty belongs to shorter stories. Instead, We will follow traces, impressions, and echoes. Not to prove that a lost world existed, but to understand why the idea keeps returning, again and again. Whenever we listen closely to the oldest parts of the earth, stone is patient. It does not rush to explain itself. It does not argue, persuade, or insist. It simply remains, long after hands that shaped it have vanished. This is why stone feels honest, even when it confuses us. When something in stone does not align with our expectations, the discomfort lingers, because stone is supposed to be the final witness. It survives where memory fails. And yet, across the world, stone occasionally presents us with forms that feel strangely out of place, as if they belong to a logic we no longer recognize. In the jungles of Costa Rica, hundreds of stone spheres lie scattered across the landscape. Some are small enough to be rolled by hand, others weigh many tons. Their surfaces are smooth, their curves nearly perfect. At first glance, they feel ceremonial, intentional, unmistakably human. Archaeologists have proposed explanations. They were made by a known culture. They were shaped using simple tools over long periods of time. These explanations are reasonable, and yet something remains unresolved. There are no workshops, no unfinished examples, no clear quarry marks. Only the finished forms, precise and silent, resting where they were placed, as if the process that created them has been erased while the result remains. Perfection is not impossible in nature, but it is rare. When nature shapes stone, it usually does so unevenly, following fractures, pressures, and chance. Geometry requires intention. It requires repetition. It requires a mind that knows when to stop. The question is not whether ancient people could shape stone into spheres. They could. The question is why such care, such uniformity, appears without a visible lineage of development. Tools evolve, techniques improve, mistakes accumulate. But here, we see only the endpoint. Far to the south, on the high plains near Lake Titicaca, massive blocks of andesite and granite sit locked together with unsettling precision. At sites like Pumapunku, stones weighing many tons are cut with flat surfaces, sharp angles, and interlocking shapes that seem almost modular. Modern builders admire the craftsmanship. Explanations are offered. Stone hammers, abrasive sand, skilled labor over generations. None of this is impossible. And yet certain cuts feel excessive. Certain tolerances feel unnecessary for structures meant to be symbolic or ritual. The stones fit so tightly that even today, a blade cannot pass between them. The effort required to achieve that level of precision raises a quiet question. Why was it done this way? The question deepens when we notice what is missing. There are no crude versions, no early attempts frozen in stone, no gradual transition from rough to refined. The stonework appears abruptly, as if it arrived already knowing itself. This does not prove anything, but it suggests a gap, a missing chapter between what we assume and what we observe. In Namibia, enormous dolerite blocks lie scattered across arid ground. Many appear fractured naturally, shaped by heat and erosion. Others, however, present flat faces and right angles that feel almost architectural. Archaeologists explain them as remnants of collapsed formations or coincidental breaks. Again, a reasonable answer. Yet when similar shapes appear across continents, in environments that never interacted, the repetition begins to feel less accidental. Stone does not travel easily. Ideas do. Perhaps these are simply isolated bursts of ingenuity. Perhaps early cultures experimented briefly with advanced stonework and then abandoned it. That is possible. But innovation usually leaves debris. It leaves failed attempts, transitional forms, discarded tools. The archaeological record is rich with such evidence for nearly every known technological leap. Here, we find the leap, but not the ladder. Some researchers propose that what we are seeing is not the beginning of a technique, but its ending. That these stones represent the last expressions of a knowledge already mature, already refined, carried by people who did not have time or reason to leave behind a developmental trail. If that were true, the absence itself would make sense. A tradition can vanish suddenly. A culture can collapse in a single generation. Knowledge, when its keepers disappear, evaporates faster than stone. There is another possibility, quieter and more unsettling. That our expectations are wrong. That we assume ancient people thought the way we do, valued the same things, and built for the same reasons. What if stone was not merely material, but language? What if geometry was not decoration, but communication? A way of encoding ideas into the landscape itself, meant to endure beyond speech, beyond memory. Stone is the longest-lasting medium available to a pre-industrial world. If one wished to leave something behind, not for contemporaries, but for an unknown future, stone would be the obvious choice. But without context, that message would degrade. Shapes would remain, meaning would not. What survives would look like anomalies, curiosities that provoke debate rather than understanding. This is where discomfort enters. Not because stone proves a lost world existed, but because it refuses to settle comfortably into the one we know. Each site can be explained in isolation. Each mystery can be softened by geology, coincidence, or lost craftsmanship. But taken together, they form a pattern of unease, a suggestion that stone remembers something we have forgotten. Perhaps that memory is not of technology, but of perspective, a way of interacting with material that emphasized precision, resonance, and permanence over speed and expansion. A worldview that treated stone as collaborator rather than obstacle. Such an understanding could arise, flourish, and vanish without leaving behind the kind of artifacts we expect to find. We should be careful here. Stone does not accuse, it does not demand that we rewrite history. It simply waits. And when we encounter shapes that feel too intentional, too careful, too out of place, the correct response may not be belief or rejection, but humility. The recognition that our narrative of the past is provisional, assembled from fragments that survived by chance. If a world existed before ours, it would not announce itself with inscriptions or dates. It would whisper through anomalies, through objects that feel slightly misaligned with their surroundings, through stone that carries intention without explanation. And perhaps that is all it could leave behind. As we continue, we will see that stone is not the only material that seems to remember more than it should. In fragile ink and fading parchment and lines, drawn centuries ago, there are hints that memory may have traveled farther than land, carried forward not by monuments but by maps that appear to recall a world erased by ice and sea. Maps are fragile things. They are drawn on skin, on paper, on parchment, that yellows, curls, and dissolves with time. They burn easily, they rot. They are rewritten, recopied, and altered by every hand that touches them. Unlike stone, maps are not meant to last. They survive only when someone believes they are worth preserving. And that is what makes certain ancient maps so unsettling. Not because they exist, but because of what they seem to remember. In the early 16th century, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a chart of the known world. He did not claim originality. In fact, he was explicit about his sources. His map, he wrote, was assembled from older charts, some drawn in the time of Alexander, others inherited from unknown origins. To most historians, this is unremarkable. Mapmakers have always copied one another. Knowledge accumulates through repetition. Yet when modern researchers examined the Piri Reis map closely, something curious emerged. Parts of the southern coastline appear to resemble Antarctica, not as it exists today, buried beneath ice, but as it might appear if the ice were removed. This does not prove that ancient people mapped Antarctica. That conclusion would be reckless. There are reasonable explanations. The lines may depict a distorted South America. They may represent speculative geography, imagined extensions of land based on classical theories. Projection errors can produce strange coincidences. And coincidence, especially when examined long after the fact, is a powerful illusion. Still, the discomfort remains. Antarctica has been ice-covered for thousands of years. If a coastline beneath that ice appears on a map, even imperfectly, the question naturally arises. What source could have inspired it? The Piri Reis map is not alone. In 1531, a French scholar named Orens Fine published a world map that included a southern continent drawn with rivers and interior features. Once again, historians explain this through inherited classical ideas, particularly the ancient belief in a balanced Earth, where a southern landmass must exist to counter the weight of the north. This explanation makes sense. Yet, as with Piri Reis, some of the features on Fine's map align uncomfortably well with terrain discovered only centuries later through modern surveying techniques, not precisely, not conclusively, but close enough to provoke questions that do not fully fade. There are also the portolan charts of the medieval Mediterranean. These maps, created by unknown hands, display coastlines with remarkable accuracy. Their precision is especially striking when it comes to distances and angles, details that should have been difficult to calculate without a reliable method for determining longitude. Historians argue that these charts were refined gradually through dead reckoning, accumulated sailing experience, and constant correction. This too is plausible. Sailors are excellent observers. The sea teaches quickly, but some portolan maps depict proportions that remain difficult to reconcile with the navigational tools available at the time. Each of these maps, taken alone, can be explained. Each explanation is reasonable. That is important. What makes them unsettling is not any single detail, but the pattern that emerges when they are viewed together. Maps from different regions, different centuries, and different cultures seem to hint at a deeper layer of geographic knowledge. A layer that may not belong to the mapmakers themselves, but to something they inherited, copied, and gradually misunderstood. Imagine the process. A scribe copies a chart from an older source. He does not know where the original information came from. He does not understand the mathematics embedded in its curves. He preserves the shape, not the system. Centuries later, another mapmaker copies his work, altering it slightly to match contemporary understanding. The data survives, but its meaning erodes. Eventually, scholars examine the final version and find features that feel out of place, not because they are impossible, but because their origin has been lost. If a maritime culture had existed during the last ice age, when sea levels were dramatically lower, the world would have looked very different. Continental shelves now submerged would have been exposed. Coastlines would extend far beyond their present boundaries. Islands would be larger, closer together, forming natural pathways across oceans. In such a world, navigation would not be exceptional. It would be essential. People living by the sea would learn the sky, the currents, the winds. They would map their world, not for exploration, but for survival. When the ice melted and the seas rose, that world would vanish. Harbors would flood. Coastal cities would disappear beneath water. The maps would become obsolete overnight. But some might survive, carried inland by refugees, preserved as curiosities, copied by later cultures who no longer recognized the landscapes they depicted. Over time, those maps would look strange, even impossible, not because they were wrong, but because the world they described no longer existed. This interpretation does not require advanced technology. It requires continuity of observation, knowledge passed down across generations, an intimate relationship with the sea and the sky. None of this violates what we know about human capability. It simply extends it further back in time than we are accustomed to imagining. And that extension is what creates resistance. Our timelines feel stable because they are familiar. To lengthen them feels like destabilizing the ground beneath our feet. Of course, there is another explanation. Human beings are excellent at finding patterns. Given enough lines, we will see shapes that feel meaningful. Modern researchers, armed with satellite imagery and digital overlays, may be projecting contemporary knowledge backward onto imperfect historical artifacts. This is a real danger, and responsible inquiry must acknowledge it. The maps do not force a conclusion, they invite caution as much as curiosity. Yet even caution has limits. When multiple anomalies cluster around the same themes, coastlines beneath ice, precision without clear lineage, knowledge appearing without obvious origin, the discomfort returns. Not loudly, quietly, like a memory you cannot place, but cannot dismiss. Maps are records of relationship, between people and land, between travelers and horizons. To draw a coastline accurately, one must know it, not imagine it, not theorize it, but walk it, sail it, return to it again and again. That kind of knowledge is earned slowly. If some ancient maps carry echoes of coastlines now drowned or frozen, then they may be the last fragile remnants of a world that no longer has a surface. Perhaps that world left little else behind. Stone survives. Maps rarely do. If a few fragments endured by chance, distorted by copying in time, they would not stand as proof. They would stand as questions. And questions, when repeated often enough, begin to feel like pressure. The kind that suggests there is more beneath the surface than we have yet uncovered. As we move deeper, the anomalies grow heavier, not only in ink and stone, but in the very layers of the earth itself, where objects appear that refuse to stay within their assigned ages, emerging from depths where no human story is supposed to exist. The earth keeps time in layers. Each stratum is a page pressed flat by pressure and patience, recording what lived, what died, and what was buried. When archaeologists and geologists read these layers, they expect order. Older below, younger above, simpler forms giving way to more complex ones. This expectation is not arbitrary. It is built from countless successful predictions. And yet, every so often, something appears in the wrong place. An object, a bone, a shape that refuses to stay within its assigned age. These are the moments that unsettle, not because they overturn everything we know, but because they resist being absorbed smoothly into the story. In the late 19th century, miners digging through ancient gravels in California reported something extraordinary. Deep beneath volcanic deposits, sealed layers believed to be millions of years old, they claimed to have found human remains. Skulls, tools, fragments of bone. According to established timelines, this was impossible. Anatomically modern humans should not exist in sediments that ancient. The immediate response from the scientific community was skepticism. Contamination, disturbance, objects falling into older layers through cracks or water movement. These explanations are sensible. Geological processes are complex. Layers shift. Context can be deceiving. Yet the controversy did not resolve cleanly. Reports were written and countered. Experts disagreed about whether the strata had truly been disturbed. Eventually, the debate faded, not because it was settled, but because it became uncomfortable. The objects were archived. The question remained suspended between possibility and dismissal. Silence replaced argument, and the timeline remained intact. A similar silence surrounds a small object retrieved from deep underground in Idaho, known as the Nampa figurine. It was brought up from a well drilled through layers of compacted clay and gravel, believed to be over 1 million years old. The figurine appeared intentionally shaped, resembling a human form. Critics argued that it must have fallen into the borehole during drilling, a modern intrusion masquerading as antiquity. Supporters noted the uniform mineral coating on its surface, consistent with great age. Once again, no consensus formed. The object was neither accepted nor disproven. It became another anomaly, hovering at the edges of the record. In northern Italy, excavations uncovered human skeletons embedded within marine sediments dated to the Pliocene epoch. These were not scattered fragments, but articulated remains, bodies that appeared to have been buried intact. Anatomical analysis identified them as fully modern humans. Geological dating placed them far earlier than such humans should exist. The response was swift. Intrusive burial. Later humans interred into older layers. Cracks in the sediment? Explanations that preserved the timeline, yet the excavators insisted the layers were undisturbed. As before, the disagreement never reached resolution. The skeletons were stored away, catalogued, and rarely discussed. Beyond bones, there are impressions. In limestone beds across the world, footprints appear alongside those of extinct animals. Some resemble human feet, complete with arches and heels. Paleontologists argue that erosion can mimic familiar shapes, that altered dinosaur tracks can appear deceptively human. These arguments are often correct. The human eye is quick to see itself reflected in stone, but a handful of prints show details that complicate dismissal. Proportions that feel intentional, patterns that repeat, they do not prove coexistence. They simply refuse to disappear. In Texas, along the Paluxy River, such tracks became the center of intense debate. Dinosaur footprints preserved in limestone appear alongside impressions that some interpret as human. Mainstream science rejects the idea of humans and dinosaurs walking together, attributing the human-like shapes to erosion or misidentification. This position is well supported. Yet even here, a few researchers note features that do not fit neatly into the explanation. The debate persists, quiet but unresolved, like a low hum beneath the consensus. Then there are objects found embedded in coal seams, metallic shapes encased within rock layers tens of millions of years old. Most are explained as contamination, mining debris introduced during extraction. Some are hoaxes, others remain ambiguous. The pattern is always the same. An anomaly appears. A reasonable explanation is offered. The explanation may be correct, but the anomaly does not fully vanish. It lingers as an outlier, a data point that does not quite align. It is important to be careful here. Science is not ignoring these finds out of arrogance. It is cautious because timelines matter. They are built from enormous bodies of evidence. To overturn them requires extraordinary proof. Anomalies, by definition, are weak on their own. They lack context. They lack replication. And yet, when anomalies accumulate across continents and centuries, they begin to suggest not a conclusion, but a question. How much irregularity can a system absorb before it must be re-examined? Perhaps these finds represent nothing more than errors and coincidences, or perhaps they hint at extinct branches of humanity, hominin lineages that rose and vanished without leaving a clear trail. Evolution is not linear. It experiments. It produces side paths and dead ends. Entire species can disappear, leaving only faint traces in bone and gene. If that is the case, then some anomalies may reflect human-like beings far older than our own lineage. Not a lost civilization, but a lost chapter of biological history. There is a more speculative possibility, one that remains on the edge of acceptability, that intelligence itself may have emerged more than once, that awareness, tool, use, and culture could arise, be erased, and arise again under the right conditions. In a planet as old and unstable as Earth, this is not inconceivable. It is simply uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that we are unique, that we are the first to think, to shape, to remember. The fossil record is incomplete by nature. Preservation is rare. Time destroys more than it saves. If a culture existed hundreds of thousands of years ago, its cities would be dust, its tools would be corroded, its bones scattered or crushed beyond recognition. Only fragments preserved by chance would remain, sealed in clay or stone, stripped of context. Those fragments would look exactly like what we find. Objects that seem too old, bones that appear in the wrong place, impressions that do not fit. These do not prove a lost world. They do something quieter. They erode certainty. They remind us that the timeline we rely on is a model, not a memory. A reconstruction built from what survived, not a record of everything that existed. And when something refuses to fit, the easiest response is to set it aside, not because it is false, but because it is inconvenient. As we continue, the question shifts. If there were worlds before ours, what could erase them so completely? What force could reduce entire cultures to whispers in stone and bone? To answer that, we must look not at artifacts, but at the planet itself, and the moments when its slow rhythms break, and history is reset in a single, irreversible turn. Most of the time, the Earth changes slowly. Mountains rise by millimeters. Continents drift at the pace of fingernails. Species adapt over spans so long that a single lifetime cannot perceive them. This gradual rhythm is what allows civilizations to grow. Stability gives memory time to anchor itself. Knowledge accumulates. Traditions deepen, but scattered through the planet's history are moments when this rhythm breaks, when change does not creep forward but strikes, sudden and overwhelming. These are the resets. And if a world existed before ours, it is within these moments that its disappearance would be written. Around 12,800 years ago, something interrupted the planet's slow warming at the end of the last ice age. The climate had been shifting towards stability. Ice sheets were retreating, forests were spreading north. Human groups were adapting to a changing world, experimenting with new ways of living, and then, abruptly, the trend reversed. Temperatures dropped sharply across the northern hemisphere. Glaciers surged back. Ecosystems collapsed. Archaeologists call this interval the Younger Dryas. To geologists, it is a thin, dark line in the earth. To anyone who lived through it, it would have felt like the end of the world. The evidence for this rupture is subtle but widespread. Across continents, scientists have identified a boundary layer rich in soot, platinum, and microscopic diamonds formed under extreme heat and pressure. Charcoal appears suddenly in soils that were previously stable. Species that had survived thousands of years of glacial advance vanish in a geological instant. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats disappear from the record. Human cultures that existed before this boundary fade or transform beyond recognition. What caused this sudden reversal remains debated. One explanation points to massive disruptions in ocean circulation. As ice sheets melted, torrents of fresh water poured into the North Atlantic, weakening currents that distribute heat around the globe. The result would be rapid cooling, especially in the north. This hypothesis fits many climate models. It does not require catastrophe from above, only the cascading effects of melting ice. Another hypothesis looks to the sun. Periods of intense solar activity can trigger widespread wildfires and atmospheric changes. A surge of radiation could explain some of the burning evident in the geological record. This idea, too, has merit. The sun has always been an unpredictable partner in Earth's climate story. Then there is the most controversial explanation, that a large comet, already fragmenting, entered the atmosphere and exploded in multiple airbursts across the planet. Not a single impact crater, but a chain of detonations powerful enough to ignite forests, melt surface materials, and inject vast quantities of dust into the atmosphere. Supporters of this idea point to the chemical signatures found in the boundary layer, the platinum anomalies, the microspherules, the nanodiamonds. Critics counter that no definitive crater has been found. Advocates respond that airbursts do not always leave craters, citing the Tunguska explosion of 1908 as a modern example. The debate continues, unresolved, and perhaps it will remain so. But what matters here is not which explanation is correct. What matters is the effect, a world reset. Fire, followed by cold, instability on a scale that no small human group could control. If there had been societies living in stable coastal regions, relying on predictable seasons and resources, the younger Dryas would have been catastrophic. Crops would fail. Game would vanish. Familiar landscapes would become hostile. Imagine a community living near the edge of a glacier-fed river. Generations have learned its rhythms. Then, within a few seasons, the river changes. Floods tear through valleys. Winters grow harsher. Summers shorten. The sky dims with dust and smoke. Animals migrate or die. Survival becomes immediate, desperate. There is no time to preserve knowledge, only to escape. Those who live carry memory. Those who die take it with them. This is how civilizations end without ruins. Not with armies or firestorms recorded in chronicles, but with environmental collapse that leaves no center intact. Structures built of wood are swept away. Stone structures crack under frost and flood. Anything near the coast is lost as sea levels shift violently in the centuries that follow. What remains are fragments scattered too widely to tell a coherent story. And the younger Dryas was not unique. Earth's climate has swung abruptly many times before. Roughly every 100,000 years, orbital variations known as Milankovitch cycles drive the planet between glacial and interglacial states. These transitions are not always smooth. Ice cores reveal sudden drops and rises in temperature, abrupt enough to reshape ecosystems within a human lifetime. Each cycle has the potential to erase what came before. If a civilization arose during a warm interval long before the younger Dryas, tens of thousands of years earlier, its fate would have been sealed by these cycles. Advancing ice would grind landscapes flat. Retreating ice would unleash floods that rearranged continents. Over time, oceans would reclaim vast areas of exposed land. The planet would not remember cities. It would remember only stone, scattered and worn. This raises an uncomfortable possibility, that the absence of ancient civilizations in the archaeological record may not indicate that they never existed, but that they were erased by forces far larger than any culture could withstand. The younger Dryas may be the most recent example of such a reset, but it may not have been the first. Each reset clears the surface, allowing life to begin again, while burying the memory of what came before. What survives a reset is not infrastructure, but adaptability. Those who endure are not the most advanced, but the most flexible. Small groups, mobile groups, people who carry knowledge in their bodies and stories rather than in buildings. And when stability returns, these survivors become the ancestors of the next world, rebuilding without remembering exactly what was lost. If that is how history unfolds, then the gaps we see are not mysteries to be solved, but scars to be acknowledged. The Earth does not preserve continuous narratives. It preserves interruptions. And to understand what might have existed before Atlantis, before memory, we must accept that the planet itself is an editor, ruthless and impartial, striking entire chapters from the story whenever the conditions demand it. Beyond this reset, the world changed shape. Ice melted, seas rose, and in that slow drowning of the old coastlines, perhaps the last physical traces of a forgotten world slipped quietly beneath the water, leaving behind only questions carried forward by those who survived. When the ice began to retreat for the last time, the world did not simply warm, it transformed. Coastlines shifted outward and then collapsed inward again. Rivers changed their paths. Plains that had existed for tens of thousands of years vanished beneath rising seas. To stand on a modern shoreline is to forget how temporary coastlines truly are. We look at the ocean and imagine it has always been there, calm and familiar. But during the height of the last ice age, the sea stood more than 100 meters lower than it does today. Entire landscapes now hidden beneath water were once dry land, alive with movement. Where the English Channel now cuts between Britain and Europe, a broad plain once stretched, known to us as Doggerland. It was not an empty corridor, but a living world of rivers, forests, and animals. People hunted there, gathered there, raised children there. When the ice melted, Doggerland did not disappear all at once. It drowned slowly, generation by generation, until the last hills became islands and then sank. No cities were recorded. No monuments remain above water. Only fragments dredged from the seabed remind us that a human world once existed there at all. Further east, a vast region known as Sundaland connected much of Southeast Asia into a single landmass. What are now islands were once mountains and highlands surrounded by fertile lowlands. Rivers flowed where coral reefs now grow. If people lived along those ancient coasts, their settlements would now rest far below the waves. Salt water is unforgiving. It dissolves wood, it corrodes metal, it breaks stone over time. The ocean does not preserve memory. It erases it patiently. To the north, Beringia formed a broad bridge between Siberia and Alaska. It is often remembered only as a migration route, a frozen corridor crossed by people moving into the Americas. But Beringia was not merely a passage. It was a homeland, a stable ecosystem that existed for thousands of years, supporting plants, animals, and human communities. When sea levels rose, Beringia vanished almost entirely. Its people either moved or disappeared. Their stories were not written. Their settlements were submerged. Their existence survives only in genetic traces and scattered tools found along eroding coasts. If a civilization older than Atlantis existed, logic suggests it would have favored the edges of the sea. Coasts provide food, trade routes, and movement. They connect rather than isolate. Early maritime cultures would have thrived where land met water, where navigation offered opportunity and survival depended on understanding tides, winds, and stars. But these are precisely the places least likely to survive a global reset. When oceans rise, they do not merely flood cities. They remove them from history. Consider how quickly water reshapes the land. Storms strip soil. Waves undermine foundations. Coral grows over edges, blurring straight lines into curves. Within centuries, even massive stone structures can be reduced to ambiguous shapes. After thousands of years, distinguishing between nature and intention becomes almost impossible. What remains looks accidental, and what looks accidental is easily dismissed. Modern explorers occasionally find shapes beneath the sea that provoke debate. Terraces off the coast of Japan, geometric patterns near India, structures in the Bahamas that resemble roads or walls. Some are undoubtedly natural. Erosion can create striking regularity. Others remain uncertain. The problem is not that these finds are convincing, but that they are ambiguous. And ambiguity rarely survives long in official narratives. It invites speculation, and speculation makes institutions uncomfortable. If cities once existed along ancient coastlines, they would not announce themselves clearly to us now. They would appear broken, scattered, softened by water. Without inscriptions, without recognizable tools, they would look like geological curiosities. A straight edge here, a flat surface there. Nothing that demands attention. And yet, taken together, they would form a pattern, one that only becomes visible when we accept how much of the human world now lies underwater. The rise of the oceans after the last ice age was not gentle. Meltwater surged into the seas at times catastrophically. Coastlines retreated inland rapidly. People living near the water would have faced repeated displacement. Each move would fragment memory further. Maps would become useless. Place names would lose their meaning. Stories tied to drowned landscapes would feel unreal to later generations. Eventually, the sea would claim not only land, but identity. This process explains something that often feels paradoxical. How could a civilization exist without leaving clear ruins? The answer may be simple. It did leave ruins. We just cannot see them. They are buried beneath water and sediment, beyond the reach of casual discovery. And even if we find them, recognizing them for what they are may be impossible without context. What survives such drowning is not architecture, but habits. Skills passed from parent to child. Knowledge of stars. Understanding of currents. Ways of reading the sky and sea that remain useful even when the coast has changed. Survivors moving inland would carry this knowledge with them, adapting it to new environments. Over time, what was once practical becomes ritual. What was once navigational becomes symbolic. What was once survival becomes myth. If this sounds familiar, it is because many ancient cultures carry stories of a great flood, of lands swallowed by water, of ancestors who escaped destruction and taught the survivors how to live again. These stories are not identical, but their rhythm is shared. Loss, survival, rebuilding. They do not prove that a prehistoric civilization existed, but they make sense in a world where coastlines vanished on a scale difficult to imagine today. As the seas rose and the old world drowned, the planet did not simply erase a landscape, it erased a way of life. The memory of that life, stripped of its geography, would have felt dreamlike to later generations. And without physical anchors, it would fade. What remains would be a sense of absence. A feeling that something important was lost, even if no one could say exactly what. Perhaps this is why the idea of a world before Atlantis persists. Not because we remember it clearly, but because we feel the gap it left behind. The oceans are quiet, but they are not empty. Beneath their surface lies most of the human past. And if there was a civilization that rose before ours, the sea may have been its final archive, sealing its remains in silence, while its faintest echoes continued inland, carried forward by the people who survived. If stone forgets slowly and the ocean forgets completely, the human body remembers in ways that are far harder to see. Memory does not belong only to ruins and artifacts. It can be carried forward quietly, folded into flesh, encoded in forms that do not announce themselves as history. When researchers first began to read the human genome, they expected clarity, a branching tree, a clean progression from ancestor to descendant. What they found instead was something more fragmented, more haunted. Gaps, shadows, traces of lineages that no longer exist. Modern humans carry genetic material that does not belong solely to Homo sapiens. This much is accepted. Neanderthal DNA persists in populations across Europe and Asia. Denisovan genes appear in Melanesian and some Asian populations, influencing traits such as altitude tolerance and immune response. These discoveries already complicate the idea of a single, linear human story. They show that our ancestors met others like themselves, interbred, and absorbed fragments of those lineages into what would eventually become us. But beyond these known relatives, geneticists have identified something stranger. Segments of DNA that do not match Neanderthals, Denisovans, or any known hominin fossils. These are often referred to as ghost populations. They are not myths. They are statistical necessities, inferred from patterns in the genome that cannot be explained by known groups. Whoever these beings were, they lived, reproduced, and vanished so thoroughly that only faint genetic echoes remain. No tools, no bones, no names. This alone tells us something important. Entire human-like populations can disappear without leaving a visible archaeological footprint. The fossil record is not a census, it is a lottery. Preservation depends on chance. A body must die in the right place, be buried quickly, avoid disturbance, and survive geological pressure without being destroyed. Most lives never meet those conditions. Most cultures vanish without leaving a trace we can recognize. If this can happen over tens of thousands of years, what might happen over hundreds of thousands? Some of these ghost lineages diverged from the human line far earlier than Neanderthals or Denisovans. Their genetic distance suggests steep time. Hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps more. Yet they encountered our ancestors closely enough to leave behind descendants. This implies coexistence, overlap, worlds intersecting and then separating again. It hints at a human past that was not sparse and lonely, but crowded with variations of intelligence, adapting to different niches, climates, and catastrophes. Genetics offers another unsettling insight. It does not only record ancestry, it records survival. Trauma leaves marks, not just psychological ones, but biological ones. Epigenetics, the study of chemical changes that affect how genes are expressed, has shown that experiences such as famine, extreme stress, and environmental shock can influence not only those who endure them, but their children and grandchildren as well. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Studies of populations that survive starvation or displacement show inherited changes in metabolism, stress response, and health. These are not memories in the conscious sense. They are tendencies, sensitivities, a heightened alertness to scarcity, a nervous system tuned to danger. If trauma on the scale of a single generation can echo forward, what about trauma on the scale of a planet? Imagine a lineage living near a coast that disappears beneath rising seas. The survivors flee inland, carrying fear, loss, and urgency. Their children grow up with stories of water that swallowed the world. Their grandchildren inherit not the stories, but the caution, a deep unease around sudden change, a reverence for high ground, an instinctive respect for cycles they cannot explain. Over time, the cause is forgotten, but the response remains. This idea remains speculative. Mainstream science is careful here, and rightly so. Epigenetic effects across thousands of years are still debated, but the question itself is revealing. It suggests that not all memory requires monuments. Some memory is embodied. Some memory moves quietly through generations, shaping behavior without ever becoming narrative. If civilizations existed before ours and were erased by cataclysm, their survivors would not pass down blueprints or manuals. They would pass down habits, ways of responding to the environment, skills that increased survival, knowledge of seasonal danger, sensitivity to the sky, the sea, the earth beneath their feet. Over time, as conditions stabilized, these survival strategies would detach from their original purpose. They would become rituals, beliefs, intuitions. This may help explain why certain myths feel universal. Flood stories, fire from the sky, ages destroyed and reborn. These narratives appear in cultures separated by vast distances and time. They are not identical, but they rhyme. Perhaps they are not records of a single event, but echoes of repeated catastrophes remembered in fragments. Cultural memory is resilient. but it degrades, it simplifies, it survives by becoming symbolic. There is something humbling in this possibility, that we may carry within us traces of worlds we no longer remember consciously, that our instincts, our fears, even our sense of awe when standing before ancient sites may not be entirely learned. They may be inherited responses to patterns repeated across deep time, rise, collapse, survival. Forgetting if that is so, then the human story is not only written in stone and sediment, it is written in blood, in cellular processes older than language, in bodies shaped by countless generations of adaptation to a planet that changes without warning. The silence of lost civilizations may not be total, it may live on, quietly, in the way we respond to uncertainty, to cycles, to the sense that the ground beneath us is never as stable as we hope. As we move forward, the focus shifts again. From memory carried inward to memory expressed outward. Because if fragments of ancient knowledge survived catastrophe, they may have found expression not in writing, but in structures designed to interact with the human body itself. Places where stone, sound, and perception come together in ways that still affect us. Long after their original purpose has faded, there are places in the world where stone does more than stand, it responds. You can feel it when you step inside, even before you understand why. The air behaves differently. Sound lingers. Silence feels thick, as if it has weight. These are not the grand ruins that overwhelm with size or height. They are subtler. Chambers carved into earth and rock where something intangible seems carefully arranged. Not decoration, not symbolism alone. Something functional, though its function is no longer obvious. Beneath the island of Malta lies the hypogeum of Calsafline, a subterranean complex carved entirely from limestone. It descends through multiple levels, its walls smoothed and curved with intent. In one chamber, often called the oracle room, a low male voice spoken softly does something unexpected. It does not echo in the way sound normally does. Instead, it deepens, amplifies, and spreads through the structure, vibrating the walls and the body at a frequency that is felt as much as heard. Visitors describe the sensation in similar terms: calming, disorienting, immersive. The stone itself seems to participate. No instructions remain to explain why the chamber was shaped this way. No texts describe its purpose. Archaeologists identify the hypogeum as a ritual site, perhaps funerary. That may be true, but the acoustic behavior is not accidental. It is too precise, too repeatable. It suggests that the builders understood something about sound, resonance, and human perception, not as abstraction, but as experience. Across the Mediterranean, the Great Pyramid of Giza offers a quieter version of the same mystery. Inside the king's chamber, sound behaves strangely. A tone spoken or struck does not scatter, it lingers. Granite blocks vibrate faintly beneath the hand. The sarcophagus rings like a tuning vessel when tapped. Engineers can describe these effects. They can model them, but describing is not the same as explaining why such precision was necessary. The chamber feels tuned, as if designed not just to house something, but to interact with the human presence. Further south, on the high plateau above Cusco, the massive stones of Sacsayhuaman interlock with astonishing accuracy. Their visual precision is striking, but it is the subtler qualities that linger. When wind passes through the walls, it produces a low hum. Certain stones ring when struck. The structure distributes weight and vibration in ways that feel intentional. Similar phenomena appear in the megalithic temples of Malta, where specific rooms amplify particular frequencies, while others dampen sound almost completely. At Stonehenge, voices behave oddly within the ring. Sounds carry upward and inward, while dissipating outside. Some of the blue stones produce clear, bell-like tones when struck. At Chichen Itza, a single clap at the base of the pyramid returns as a sharp, chirping echo, filtered by the cascading steps into a sound resembling a bird call. Engineers can analyze these effects after the fact, but analysis does not answer the deeper question. Why do these effects appear again and again, across cultures that supposedly had no contact? It is tempting to frame these phenomena as coincidences. After all, stone has physical properties. Any enclosed space will shape sound in some way, but the consistency of these effects, their repetition in places associated with ritual, gathering, and significance, suggests intention. Perhaps not in the modern sense of engineering blueprints, but in a more intuitive understanding of how space interacts with the human body. Imagine a culture that experiences sound not merely as communication, but as force. Vibration affects matter. It moves water. It can induce emotional and physiological responses. Even today, certain frequencies influence heart rate, breathing, and mood. A people living close to natural rhythms, without artificial noise, would be acutely aware of this. They might discover that certain tones calm the mind. Others disorient. Some make stones seem to hum in response. Over generations, such discoveries could become tradition, then technique. This does not require machines. It requires attention, patience, a willingness to listen. If such knowledge existed, it would be difficult to preserve through catastrophe. It would not be written down. It would be practiced. When the practitioners vanished, the knowledge would vanish with them, leaving behind only the structures that still respond when touched in the right way. Perhaps resonance was once a tool, a way of measuring space, a way of shaping stone by understanding how it vibrates under stress, or a way of aligning human bodies and minds during communal events. We cannot say, but we can say is that these places still work. Whatever their original purpose, the interaction between sound, stone, and human perception remains active thousands of years later. This raises an unsettling possibility that ancient builders understood aspects of material behavior that we are only beginning to rediscover, not through equations, but through embodied knowledge, through repeated experience passed down across generations. Such understanding could arise, flourish, and disappear without leaving behind anything that looks like technology to us. And without context, it would be easy to dismiss it as ritual alone. If a world existed before ours, and if its people interacted with stone and sound in ways that shaped their architecture, then resonance would be one of the few aspects capable of surviving a reset. Stone endures. Sound does not, but the spaces that shape it do. They wait, silent until someone steps inside and speaks. And perhaps that is why these places still affect us. Not because they are mystical in a supernatural sense, but because they were designed to engage the human nervous system directly, to create a sense of presence, focus, and connection. In a post-cataclysm world, stripped of context, such spaces would feel sacred, even if their original function was practical. As we listen to these stones sing faintly across time, another question emerges. If such knowledge once existed, who carried it forward when the world changed? Who remembered the sky, the sea, the rhythms that allowed people to orient themselves in a transformed landscape? The answer may lie not in monuments, but in stories of survivors, teachers, and watchers, who appear again and again in the myths that followed great destruction. After catastrophe, the world does not restart evenly. Knowledge does not return all at once, and it does not return everywhere. It gathers in pockets, carried by those who remember something others do not. In the myths that follow great destruction, certain figures appear again and again. They are not kings or conquerors. They arrive after the flood, after the fire, after the silence. They teach, they warn, they point to the sky, and then, just as quietly, they disappear. In the Andes, Viracocha is described as a bearded stranger who emerges after a great flood. He brings order to a broken world, teaches people how to build, how to farm, how to observe the heavens, and then walks away across the sea. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl appears in similar form, a culture bringer who arrives after destruction, carrying knowledge of calendars, agriculture, and astronomy. In Mesopotamia, Oannes rises from the sea, half human, half fish, teaching, writing, law, and science to a people who had forgotten how to live. In Egypt, Osiris is remembered not simply as a god of the dead, but as a civilizer who came from elsewhere, bringing structure and order after chaos. These figures are often called gods in modern retellings, but the original stories are more ambiguous. They are different, not divine in the abstract sense. They possess knowledge that others do not. They are survivors of something older. Myth has a way of magnifying difference into divinity. When technology or understanding appears without explanation, it becomes sacred by default. This pattern is difficult to ignore. Cultures separated by oceans and millennia tell variations of the same story. A world is destroyed. Survivors emerge. Knowledge is reintroduced. The builders of the New Age do not invent their systems from nothing. They inherit fragments. Calendars appear already complex. Astronomy begins already precise. Architecture aligns immediately with solstices, equinoxes, and star paths that require generations of observation to recognize. Consider the sky. It is the one reference that survives every catastrophe. Mountains erode, rivers change course, coastlines vanish, but the stars remain, shifting slowly over tens of thousands of years. For a people whose world was unstable, whose coastlines drowned, and whose lands froze or burned, the sky would become the only reliable archive. To watch it carefully would be an act of survival. Across the ancient world, we find evidence of this devotion. In Peru, the 13 towers of Chanquilo track the movement of the sun across the horizon throughout the year. In Egypt, the pyramids of Giza align with cardinal directions and celestial patterns with astonishing precision. In Central America, Maya observatories track the cycles of Venus across centuries. At Stonehenge, stones mark solar and lunar events that occur only rarely. These structures do not represent guesswork, they represent continuity. Continuity is the key. A single generation cannot map long celestial cycles. Knowledge of precession, for example, unfolds over thousands of years. To notice it requires records, memory, and transmission. If later civilizations inherited this knowledge, they did not inherit its origin story. They inherited only the results, alignments without explanations, calendars without context, sky lore without the catastrophe that made it necessary. This may explain why ancient cultures invested so much energy in watching the heavens, not out of superstition, but caution. If the sky once delivered destruction, then the sky deserved constant attention. Comet trails, unusual planetary alignments, shifts in seasonal patterns, these could be warnings. The watchers, the astronomer priests, may have been less concerned with worship and more concerned with pattern recognition. In this light, myths of teacher figures take on a different tone. They may not describe gods descending from the heavens, but people who remembered what the sky could do. Survivors of an earlier world who understood cycles long enough to know that stability was temporary. When they taught agriculture, architecture, and astronomy, they were not creating culture from nothing. They were rebuilding, adapting old knowledge to a changed planet. Over generations, as memory faded, these teachers became symbols. Their warnings became rituals. Their observations became sacred stories. And eventually, their human origins dissolved entirely, leaving behind figures that seemed too wise, to knowing, to be mortal. Myth does not preserve detail. It preserves importance. There is a quiet sadness in this transformation. Knowledge that once meant survival becomes story. Story becomes legend. Legend becomes religion. And the original reason for watching the sky is forgotten. The monuments remain. The alignments persist, but the fear that shaped them fades into abstraction. If a civilization existed before Atlantis, its last custodians may not have left cities or machines behind. They may have left calendars, alignments, stories that repeat the same warning in different languages, that the world ends, that it begins again, that the sky remembers. These myths do not prove that such survivors existed, but they explain why the same motifs appear everywhere, why knowledge sometimes seems to arrive fully formed, why early civilizations appear to step suddenly into complexity. They may not have been starting from zero. They may have been starting from fragments. As we approach the end of this journey, the question shifts once more. If knowledge was inherited, even imperfectly, was there ever an attempt to preserve it more directly, to hide it, to seal it away against catastrophe itself? This question gathers one of the most enduring symbols of lost memory on Earth. A silent guardian, carved from stone, staring across the desert, said to watch over something buried beneath. There are places where silence feels intentional, not empty, not abandoned, but watchful. The Giza Plateau is one of those places. Long before the modern city pressed against its edges, before the desert settled into its current shape, something enormous was carved directly from the bedrock there. The Great Sphinx does not rise from stacked blocks like the pyramids behind it. It emerges from the earth itself, as if uncovered rather than built. And this difference has always mattered. Traditional history assigns the Sphinx to a known dynasty, a known ruler, a known time. Yet some geologists have pointed to patterns of erosion along its body that resemble sustained rainfall rather than desert wind. Heavy rain has not touched the Giza Plateau in thousands of years, not since the end of the last ice age. If that erosion reading is even partially correct, then the Sphinx may predate the civilization that later surrounded it, not as a symbol of Egypt, but as something inherited by it. Beneath and around the Sphinx, seismic surveys have detected cavities in the bedrock, empty spaces, chambers that do not match known tunnels or tombs. Engineers describe them cautiously as natural voids. Perhaps they are, but their symmetry invites speculation. And into that speculation flows an ancient idea, the Hall of Records, a place where knowledge from a previous world was hidden, sealed against flood, fire, and forgetting. This idea appears in many cultures, not just Egypt, stories of wisdom buried in stone, preserved beneath temples or mountains, until a future age is ready to rediscover it. Whether such a chamber exists physically is almost beside the point. What matters is what it represents. The belief that knowledge was once lost, and that someone tried to save it. Perhaps the earth itself is that archive. Stone holds memory. Fossils hold memory. DNA holds memory. The sky holds memory. None of them speak in words, but all of them retain patterns. When we find anomalies, we are not uncovering secrets so much as brushing against echoes, hints of complexity that do not belong entirely to our time. And so the story closes, not with answers, but with a softened awareness, that humanity may not be a single ascent, but many. That worlds can rise, fall, and vanish so completely that only faint impressions remain. That forgetting is not failure, but a natural consequence of time moving forward. As you let this idea settle, there is no need for urgency. The past does not demand belief. It invites listening. Somewhere beneath stone and sea, beneath myth and molecule, there may be memories of other ages. Or perhaps there are only patterns we are still learning how to read. Either way, the world feels deeper when we allow for the possibility that we are not the first to stand here, wondering who came before. The desert grows quiet again. The stars continue their slow movement overhead, and the stone, patient as ever, keeps whatever it knows.